Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There are monsters in the Imperium of man that wear the Emperor's colors. They march beneath the banners of his holy Adeptus Astartes, these space marines who are meant to be humanity's greatest protectors, its shield against the darkness. But among their number exists a chapter whose very name brings silence to war councils, whose arrival on the battlefield means something far worse than simple victory or defeat. They are clad in bronze that seems to drink in the light of distant stars, their helms fashioned after creatures from ancient Terran myth. And when they come not to save, but to execute. They are the Minotaurs, and their story is one written in the blood of their fellow space marines. Picture, if you will, a fortress monastery deep in the void between stars. Within its iron halls, as another chapter of the Adeptus Astartes prepares for war, their banners proud, their faith unshakable. They have fought for centuries in the Emperor's name, earning glory on 100 worlds, their battle honors stretching back through the long years of Imperial history. They know themselves to be heroes, defenders of mankind, and they go about their preparations with the confidence of warriors who have proven themselves time and again. Then the warning comes, a single message, terse and cold as the void itself. The Minotaurs are coming. The fortress goes silent. Even the most veteran warriors feel something twist in their chests, something that might be called fear if space marines were capable of such weakness. They know what it means when the bronze-clad executioners arrive. The Minotaurs do not come to fight Xenos. They do not come to purge heretics or push back the forces of chaos. They come when the High Lords of Terror themselves have decided that a Space Marine chapter has strayed too far from the path, when the Imperium's own defenders must be brought to heel or destroyed utterly. And they come without mercy, without hesitation, without doubt. This is the truth of the Minotaurs, a truth that has been whispered in the dark corners of the Imperium for millennia, but never spoken aloud where others might hear. They are the knife that the High Lords hold at the throat of every other Space Marine chapter, a constant reminder that even the Emperor's chosen warriors are not beyond judgment, not beyond punishment, not beyond execution if they should fail in their duties or dare to question the will of terror. And the few survivors who have faced them and lived speak of their approach with something approaching trauma. They describe how the Minotaurs fight, not with the righteous fury of typical Space Marines, not with the crusading zeal that marks most chapters, but with a cold, calculated brutality that suggests something far darker. They speak of bronze-armored figures advancing through killing fields with inexorable patience, crushing resistance beneath overwhelming firepower, giving no quarter and accepting no surrender until the moment they decide the lesson has been taught, the punishment delivered. One such survivor, a tech adept who witnessed the Minotaurs in action during the suppression of a rebellious mining colony, gave testimony that has since been sealed in the deepest vaults of the Administratum. His words, if recorded in a voice that shook with remembered terror, paint a picture of warfare conducted with mechanical precision. The bronze beast in the darkness, he called them. Footsteps that never tired, that just kept coming. No matter where the defenders turned, no matter how they tried to escape, the Minotaurs were there, patient as death itself, inexorable as gravity. But who are they really? Where did this chapter come from? And why do they operate so differently from their brothers? Why do they answer only to the highest authority in the Imperium, bypassing even the Inquisition itself when it suits them? Why are their records sealed under edicts so powerful that even those with the authority to investigate such matters find themselves turned away at every corner? These are questions that have haunted the Imperium for thousands of years. It's questions that grow more pressing with each appearance of the bronze-clad warriors, with each chapter they destroy or cripple, with each demonstration of their peculiar and terrible purpose. And yet, the answers remain hidden, locked away behind seals that bear the sign of the High Lords themselves, guarded by mysteries that grow deeper the more one looks into them. The Minotaurs are an enigma wrapped in bronze and sealed with blood. Their chapter badge, a red bull's head with black horns set against a background the color of ancient metal, is recognized across the Imperium, but rarely spoken of. Other Space Marines see it and turn away, unwilling to meet the eyes of these executioners, these kinslayers, these warriors who have made an art of destroying their own kind. And Imperial commanders, who have been forced to work alongside them, report feeling as though they were coordinating with something barely controlled, a weapon that might turn on them at any moment if the orders from Terra should change. And perhaps most disturbing of all is the fact that the Minotaurs seem to relish their role. They do not fight with the sorrow of warriors forced into a terrible duty. They do not show the reluctance of brothers forced to raise weapons against their own. Instead, they prosecute their wars against other Space Marines with what can only be described as enthusiasm, as if they have found in fratricide the ultimate test of their skills, the worthiest opponents they could hope to face. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Minotaurs represent something uniquely terrible. They are the enforcers of a tyranny so vast it spans the stars, the executioners who ensure that even the mightiest warriors of humanity remain servants rather than masters. They are proof that the Imperium's paranoia runs so deep that even its greatest defenders must be watched, controlled, and if necessary, destroyed. This is their story, as much of it as can be pieced together from sealed records and whispered accounts, from the scattered survivors of their campaigns and the few Imperial observers brave or foolish enough to chronicle their methods. It is a story of blood and bronze, of secrets and lies, of a chapter that stands apart from all others, not through nobility or heroism, but through their willingness to do what other Space Marines will not. It is a story of the Emperor's executioners, the High Lord's hunting dogs, the bronze beast that never tires and never stops. It is the story of the Minotaurs, and it begins, like so many Imperial mysteries, in the shadows of a past that someone has worked very hard to erase. Origins lost to shadow. The question of where the Minotaurs truly came from is one that leads down corridors of contradiction and dead ends, through archives that have been deliberately corrupted or sealed, past records that should exist but do not, toward a truth that someone with considerable power has gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. Even the most basic facts about their founding are disputed, wrapped in layers of misdirection that suggest a cover-up operating at the highest levels of Imperial authority. According to official records, there exists a Space Marine chapter called the Minotaurs that was created during the 21st founding, an event that has gone down in Imperial history as the Cursed Founding. This took place in the 36th Millennium, roughly 5,000 years after the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne, at a time when the Adeptus Mechanicus decided in their questionable wisdom to experiment with the gene seed of new chapters, attempting to correct flaws and eliminate weaknesses that had accumulated over the millennia. The results of these experiments were, to put it mildly, catastrophic. The 21st founding produced chapters plagued by mutations and curses, Space Marines whose very existence was a reminder of the dangers of tampering with the Emperor's sacred work, the Flame Falcons, who actually burned with literal fire until the Inquisition wiped them out, the Lamenters, cursed with such extraordinary bad luck that their entire history reads like a chronicle of undeserved suffering, the Black Dragons, with their bone blades erupting from their flesh like some terrible mockery of the Emperor's angels. And among these cursed chapters, the fragmentary records suggest, were the Minotaurs. The few documents that survive from this period describe a chapter whose gene seed was marked as chimeric, a word that in this context carries implications both blasphemous and terrifying. Chimeric gene seed means genetic material that has been mixed, combined from multiple sources, adulterated or tampered with in ways that should never have been attempted. And it suggests that whoever created the original Minotaurs took gene seed from prohibited sources, possibly even from traitor legions, and attempted to blend it into something new. The Minotaurs of this early period, if we are to believe these scattered accounts, were berserkers of the worst kind. They made war with savage abandon, eschewing all contact with other Imperial forces, throwing themselves at the enemy with little care for reconnaissance, strategy, or casualties. They would arrive in a war zone without warning, hurl themselves into combat with psychotic fury, and then withdraw just as suddenly once their bloodlust had been satisfied. They were, by all accounts, barely controllable, more hindrance than help to other Imperial forces, feared and shunned even by their fellow Space Marines, and then, sometime in the 38th millennium, they disappeared. The records simply stopped, as if the chapter had been wiped from existence, erased from the pages of Imperial history as thoroughly as if they had never been. But here is where the story becomes truly strange, where the contradictions begin to pile up in ways that suggest deliberate manipulation. Because there are also records, older records, that speak of a chapter called the Minotaurs active in the 32nd millennium, hundreds of years before the cursed founding that supposedly created them. These earlier Minotaurs are described fighting alongside other chapters during the suppression of the Solar Rebellion, coordinating with allied forces rather than working in isolation, conducting themselves with discipline and strategic acumen rather than berserker fury. Yet how can a chapter exist before its own founding? How can the same name be applied to two seemingly different organizations separated by thousands of years? The official explanation, such as it is, suggests that multiple chapters may have borne the name Minotaurs across Imperial history, that perhaps the name was recycled, given to new foundings as older chapters were destroyed or disappeared. But this explanation satisfies no one who looks closely at the evidence, who notes the peculiar similarities between these disparate accounts, who recognizes the hand of deliberate obscuration at work. The truth, whispered in corners where the Inquisition's ears cannot reach, may be far more disturbing. There are those who believe that the current Minotaurs, the bronze-clad executioners who serve the High Lords with such terrible efficiency, are not descended from the cursed founding at all. Instead, they may be something much older, a chapter that has existed in some form since the dark days of the Great Crusade itself, hidden and maintained across the millennia for purposes known only to those at the very highest levels of power. One theory, put forth by Edwin Brown, one of the developers who helped create the modern lore of the Minotaurs, suggests something that borders on heresy. He proposes that the current chapter was formed from a garrison of Iron Warriors, one of the traitor legions that turned against the Emperor during the Horus Heresy. According to this theory, this particular garrison missed the betrayal entirely, isolated on some distant outpost, continuing to serve the Imperium long after their brothers had turned to chaos. When they finally made contact during the Great Scouring, the campaigns of vengeance that followed the heresy, they were given a choice: submit to execution as traitors, or serve the Imperium in a new capacity, with their origins hidden and their shame buried beneath layers of misdirection. If this theory is true, it would explain so much. It would explain the Minotaurs' mastery of siege warfare and attrition tactics, specialties of the Iron Warriors Legion. It would explain their brooding, paranoid nature, their obsessive attention to security and protocol, their willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve their objectives. It would explain why their records are sealed under edicts that even the Inquisition cannot break, why their gene seed tithes are classified at the highest levels, why they operate with a freedom that no other chapter enjoys. It would also explain why the cursed founding Minotaurs were created, why a chapter of psychotic berserkers was deliberately engineered and then allowed to disappear. Perhaps it was all a smokescreen, a way to legitimize the existence of the hidden Iron Warriors chapter by creating a false lineage, a paper trail that would lead investigators to dead ends and contradictions rather than the terrible truth. Create a cursed chapter, let it serve for a few decades, then quietly retire it while maintaining the name for the true Minotaurs who had been operating in the shadows all along. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial but compelling. The Minotaurs' specialization in fighting other Space Marines, for instance, makes perfect sense if they are descended from traitors. Who better to hunt renegade chapters than those who understand the mindset of betrayal intimately, who carry in their gene seed the legacy of the greatest treachery in Imperial history? Their equipment, too, speaks of connections that run deeper than any normal chapter could claim. They field weapons and armor that should be beyond the reach of a relatively minor chapter, patterns and marks that suggest someone with access to the deepest armories of Mars and Terra has been supplying them for millennia. And then there are the subtle cultural markers that seem to echo across the years. The ancient Greeks of Terra, whose myths inspired the Minotaur legend, were known for their hoplite warfare, fighting in close formation with spear and shield. The Iron Warriors, before their fall, employed similar tactics, advancing in disciplined squares and ranks. The current Minotaurs carry weapons and shields marked with Terran Helak glyphs, ancient Greek symbols that do not translate directly into High or Low Gothic, suggesting connections to Terra's deep past that no chapter from the cursed founding should possess. But if the Minotaurs are indeed hidden Iron Warriors, hidden traitors serving the Imperium in secret, then why would the High Lords allow such a thing? Why would they maintain a chapter descended from those who betrayed the Emperor, rather than simply destroying them and creating a new chapter from loyal gene seed? The answer may lie in the unique value such a chapter would provide. The Imperium is not governed by morality or principle, but by necessity and pragmatism. If the High Lords needed a tool that could be wielded against other Space Marines, a chapter that would not hesitate to destroy its brothers, what better choice than one descended from traitors? Such a chapter would have no loyalty to the broader brotherhood of the Adeptus Astartes, no bonds of shared heritage that might give them pause. They would be eternally grateful for their reprieve, forever indebted to the High Lords, who had chosen to hide their shame rather than expose it. They would serve without question, knowing that their very existence depended on continued obedience, that any failure might result in their terrible secret being revealed and their destruction being ordered. In this light, the Minotaurs become something even more disturbing than simple executioners. They become proof of the Imperium's ultimate cynicism, evidence that even the sins of the Horus heresy can be forgiven if the sinners are useful enough. They represent a compact between betrayers and the betrayed, a devil's bargain struck in the shadows and maintained through 10,000 years of secrecy and lies. Of course, this theory, compelling as it may be, remains unproven. The sealed records have not been opened. The gene seed tithes have not been examined. The truth remains hidden behind layers of classification that may never be penetrated. Other theories exist, each with their own evidence and logic. Some suggest the Minotaurs are descended from other traitor legions, perhaps the World Eaters, before they were corrupted by the Butcher's nails. Others point to similarities with loyal chapters, noting tactical and cultural markers that might suggest Ultramarines or Imperial Fists' gene seed mixed with something darker. What can be said with certainty is that someone, at some point in Imperial history, decided that the truth about the Minotaurs was too dangerous to be known. The effort that has gone into concealing their origins is itself revealing, speaking to a secret of profound importance, a revelation that could shake the very foundations of how the Imperium understands its most elite warriors. Entire archives have been sealed, records have been altered or destroyed, investigators have been turned away or silenced. And through it all, the Minotaurs themselves remain silent on the subject. They do not discuss their history, do not speak of their founding or their primogenitor. When questioned, they respond with hostility or simply refuse to answer. Their paranoia and secrecy so absolute that even their allies know almost nothing of their internal culture or beliefs. They are a chapter that exists in the present, with no past and no future beyond the next campaign, the next target marked for execution. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the erasure of their history is not just about hiding a secret, but about creating a perfect weapon. A chapter with no identity beyond service, no loyalty beyond obedience, no purpose beyond the fulfillment of their terrible role. A chapter that cannot question its orders because it has no foundational myths to provide moral context, no legendary heroes to serve as examples of principled resistance, no ancient traditions that might conflict with the demands of the present. The Minotaurs, as in this sense, may represent the Imperium's ideal Space Marine chapter, stripped of all the romantic notions of honor and brotherhood that complicate the control of the Adeptus Astartes. They are tools, weapons, nothing more. And perhaps that is the greatest horror of all. The chapter reborn. The disappearance of the Minotaurs in the 38th millennium left a strange absence in Imperial records, a gap where a chapter should have been, but was not. For centuries, possibly even millennia, the name vanished from the rolls of active forces, becoming little more than a footnote in histories of the cursed founding, a cautionary tale about the dangers of tampering with gene seed. Those few who remembered the Berserker chapter that had served so briefly and so violently assumed they had destroyed themselves in their fury, or falling to some combination of genetic instability and reckless combat doctrine. But names, especially names with power, have a way of returning when they are needed. And in the early years of the 41st millennium, when the Imperium faced one of its gravest internal crises, the name Minotaurs reappeared in Imperial records with a force that shocked those who recognized it. The catalyst was the death of Lord Solar Macarius in the year 400 of the 41st millennium. Macarius had been perhaps the greatest imperial commander since the emperor himself, a general whose conquests had expanded the Imperium to its greatest extent in thousands of years. His Macarian crusade had reclaimed worlds beyond counting, pushing back the darkness and bringing entire sectors into the emperor's light. But Macarius was mortal, and when he fell, the vast territories he had conquered fell into chaos. His 7 army group generals, each commanding forces that rivaled the strength of entire sectors, refused to acknowledge the authority of Terra. They carved out their own petty empires from the worlds Macarius had won, each setting themselves up as warlord kings, repudiating their oaths of loyalty and plunging the region into civil war. Space Marine chapters that had fought together during the Crusade now found themselves on opposite sides of these conflicts, bonds of brotherhood shattering as the carefully maintained order collapsed into anarchy. This was the crisis that brought the Minotaurs back from whatever darkness had concealed them. The High Lords, watching in horror as the Macarian territories descended into chaos, needed a force that could restore order without mercy, and that could smash the nascent warlord kingdoms and remind everyone involved exactly what happened to those who betrayed their oaths to Terra. They needed executioners, and so they called upon the Minotaurs. But the chapter that emerged was profoundly different from the berserkers of old. These were not the same Minotaurs who had disappeared in the 38th millennium, or if they were, something fundamental had changed in the centuries between. The new Minotaurs, clad in bronze armor, rather than the red and yellow scheme of their supposed predecessors, arrived in the Macarian territories with a fleet of more than a dozen strike cruisers, equipped to the highest imperial standards, operating as a single cohesive force of overwhelming power. Gone was the berserker fury that had marked the old chapter. In its place was a cold, calculated approach to warfare that spoke of years of training and experience, of tactics honed to perfection, of a brotherhood that had learned to channel its aggression into precise, devastating applications of force. These Minotaurs fought with discipline, using vanguard forces to pin enemies in place before encircling them with fast-moving elements and crushing them with the full weight of the chapter's heavy armor and firepower. They coordinated with other Imperial forces when necessary, integrated their operations into larger strategic plans, demonstrated a flexibility and sophistication that should not have been possible for a chapter that had supposedly been lost for centuries. Yet they were no less brutal than their predecessors had been. If anything, their calculated approach made them more terrifying. Why? Because it was clear that every act of violence, every massacre, every ruthless execution was the result of conscious choice rather than uncontrolled rage. They did not kill because they had lost themselves to bloodlust. They killed because killing was the most efficient solution to the problem at hand, and they approached that solution with the same cold professionalism that an administratum clerk might bring to processing tithes. The Minotaurs formed the spearhead of imperial forces throughout the suppression of the Macarian heresy, as it came to be called. They shattered the petty empire of Colonel Lirius of the 11th Cardu Armored Corps, their land raiders blasting apart the famous tanks of the Carducine Immortals on the ice plains of Gyros Prime. They carried out exterminatus orders on worlds that refused to submit. I'm turning the hive world of Duval into a lifeless cinder, reducing the sword realms of the Hope Cluster to radioactive ash. Wherever resistance was strongest, wherever the warlords thought themselves most secure, there the Minotaurs appeared, relentless and unstoppable. But it was their willingness, even their eagerness, to fight other Space Marines that truly marked them as different. While other chapters agonized over the necessity of raising arms against their brothers, the Minotaurs seemed to embrace it. They pursued renegade chapters with a determination that bordered on the obsessive, hunting them across multiple systems, giving them no rest and no quarter until they had been destroyed or brought to heel. Where the transformation was so complete that many in the Departamento Munitorum questioned whether this was truly the same chapter that had borne the Minotaur's name during the cursed founding. The behavioral differences were stark. The tactical sophistication was leagues beyond what had been recorded for the Berserker chapter, and the level of equipment and resources they commanded suggested patronage at the highest levels of imperial authority. Some observers went so far as to suggest that this was an entirely new chapter, perhaps created in secret during the lost years, merely given the name Minotaurs as a convenient cover story. These questions might have been pursued further, might have been investigated by the Inquisition or the Administratum, as except for one crucial detail, someone with immense authority had sealed the Minotaur's records under edicts that could not be circumvented. When investigators tried to access the chapter's gene seed tithes, they found the archives locked behind seals bearing the mark of the High Lords themselves. When they attempted to interview chapter members about their history, they were met with hostile silence or threats of violence. When they sought to examine the chapter's founding documents, they discovered that these documents either did not exist or had been classified at levels that exceeded even inquisitorial authority. It became clear, though it was never officially stated, that the Minotaurs operated under special dispensation from the highest levels of imperial government. They answered directly to the Senatorum Imperialis, the council of high lords that governed the Imperium in the Emperor's name, and they answered to no one else, not to the Inquisition, not to other Space Marine chapters, not even to the Adeptus Ministorum or the Ecclesiarchy. They were, in effect, a private army controlled by those 12 individuals who stood at the apex of imperial power, a weapon that could be deployed according to the pronouncements of the High Lords alone. This special relationship became increasingly apparent as the Minotaurs continued their operations following the Macarian heresy. Time and again, they would appear in response to situations where Space Marine chapters had to be disciplined or destroyed, where the authority of terror needed to be reasserted through overwhelming force. They responded to summons with a speed that suggested they were constantly ready, maintained at full chapter strength and battle-ready, waiting only for the word to deploy. And they were always deployed as a complete chapter. Unlike most Space Marine organizations, which might spread their forces across multiple war zones simultaneously, the Minotaurs operated as a single overwhelming hammer blow. When they came with their full strength of nearly 1,000 warriors, supported by their entire fleet, bringing to bear firepower and resources that few enemies could hope to match. This made them somewhat inflexible, unable to respond to multiple crises simultaneously, but it also made them nearly unstoppable when they focused their attention on a single target. The implications were clear to anyone who looked. The Minotaurs had been created, or recreated, or maintained for a specific purpose. Yet they were not meant to defend the Imperium from external threats, not primarily. They were meant to serve as an internal enforcement mechanism, a reminder to other Space Marine chapters that the autonomy they enjoyed existed only at the sufferance of terror, that their brotherhood extended only as far as their obedience, and that any chapter that strayed too far from the path would face not just censure, but potential annihilation. In this light, their reappearance during the Macarian heresy takes on additional significance. The crisis had shown how quickly Space Marine chapters could turn on each other when larger structures of authority broke down, how the bonds of brotherhood could shatter in the face of conflicting loyalties and ambitions. The High Lords, witnessing this breakdown, as clearly decided that such a situation could never be allowed to develop again. They needed a chapter that stood outside the normal brotherhood of the Adeptus Astartes, one that would not hesitate to fire on their fellows, one that could be trusted to execute any order regardless of how distasteful other chapters might find it. And so the Minotaurs returned, or were revealed, or were created. Their transformation from berserker savages to disciplined executioners, whether real or fabricated, served the High Lord's purposes perfectly. They became a constant presence in Imperial consciousness, a shadow that fell across every Space Marine chapter that contemplated independence or questioned the dictates of terror. They proved that the Imperium's paranoia was not merely theoretical, that the mechanisms of control extended even to the Emperor's chosen warriors, and that disobedience would be met with overwhelming and merciless force. The chapter that emerged from those dark years carried itself with the confidence of warriors who knew their role and embraced it fully. They made no apologies for what they were, offered no justifications for their actions. When other chapters questioned their methods or their authority, the Minotaurs responded with contempt, making it clear that they considered themselves beyond such concerns. They served the Emperor through service to the High Lords, and that was all the justification they needed. Bronze and Blood, the chapter's identity. To understand the Minotaurs, one must first understand the symbols they have chosen for themselves, the imagery and iconography that they wear into battle, the visual language through which they communicate their terrible purpose. For Space Marines, these symbols are never mere decoration. They are statements of identity, declarations of purpose, connections to histories that stretch back through millennia. The Minotaur's choice of symbols speaks volumes about how they see themselves and how they wish to be seen. The chapter badge is striking in its simplicity and its menace. A red bull's head with black horns set against a background of bronze. The bull, or more specifically, the Minotaur of ancient Terran myth, was a monster that dwelt at the heart of a labyrinth, a beast that consumed the youth, sent as tribute to its master. It was, in the original myth, both prisoner and executioner, trapped within the maze, yet serving as the instrument of punishment for those who had displeased the powers that ruled above. The parallel is uncomfortable, and perhaps intentional. The Minotaurs, like their mythological namesake, serve masters who command from positions of ultimate authority. They operate within structures and hierarchies that constrain them even as they enable their terrible work. And they consume the best and brightest of their kind, the Space Marines sent against them, reducing proud chapters to scattered remnants or memory. The bronze color scheme is equally significant. Bronze is not a color commonly associated with Imperial forces. Most Space Marine chapters favor brighter, more heroic colors. The ultramarine blue of Guilliman's sons, the blood red of the Blood Angels, the dark green of the Dark Angels. Bronze, by contrast, is a color associated with age, with antiquity, with things from an earlier and perhaps darker time. It is the color of ancient weapons, of relics from Terra's pre-imperial past, of artifacts that have survived the ages, not through beauty, but through utility and endurance. When the Minotaurs march to war in their bronze armor, they present an image that is simultaneously archaic and intimidating. The color makes them seem like figures from another age, warriors who have stepped out of ancient history to prosecute wars in the present. It sets them apart visually from other chapters, marking them as different, other, not quite part of the brotherhood they hunt. The chapter's heraldry is marked with Terran Helak glyphs, symbols from the ancient Greek language that predate the Imperium by tens of thousands of years. These glyphs do not translate directly into High or Low Gothic, the common languages of the Imperium, suggesting that they carry meanings known only to the Minotaurs themselves. Some scholars have speculated that these symbols represent connections to Terra's deep past, to knowledge or traditions that survived the Age of Strife, when all other links to humanity's origins were severed.
I'll be honest, the Minotaurs make me uncomfortable in a way most 40k factions don't. They're not tragic heroes or fallen angels, they're just enforcers, tools, and maybe that's what makes them so terrifying. In a setting full of noble grimdark, there's a chapter that says the quiet part out loud about what the Imperium actually is. But anyway, let's get back to the story.
This connection to ancient Terra is reinforced by the chapter's overall cultural aesthetic. The Minotaurs employ nomenclature and organizational structures that echo the hoplite warriors of ancient Greece. Their contemptor dreadnoughts are called hecaton, a word that means giant or legion, or perhaps a monster enslaved. Their flagship bears the name Daedalus Crater, evoking the legendary craftsman who built the labyrinth in the original myth. Even their chapter master's weapon, the Black Spear, recalls the hoplite's dory, the thrusting spear that was the primary weapon of Greek heavy infantry. But where the ancient Greeks valued concepts like democracy, citizenship, and civic virtue, the Minotaurs seem to have distilled from that classical heritage only its most martial and authoritarian elements. They embody discipline, hierarchy, and ruthless efficiency. Their culture appears to be one of absolute obedience to authority, of subordination of individual will to collective purpose, of victory achieved through overwhelming force and superior organization rather than individual heroism. Those few outsiders who have observed the Minotaur's internal culture describe a chapter marked by paranoia and secrecy bordering on the pathological. Yet they maintain defensive protocols even when dealing with supposed allies, treating every interaction as a potential security breach. They share no information about their operations that is not absolutely necessary. They respond to questions about their history or their methods with hostility or threats. Some observers have gone so far as to suggest that the chapter is at the edge of madness, that their obsessive security and their contempt for others represents a kind of collective psychosis. Yet this paranoia serves a purpose. A chapter that cannot be infiltrated, cannot be compromised. A brotherhood that shares nothing with outsiders cannot have its secrets extracted through interrogation or espionage. And a force that trusts no one but itself and its masters on Terra becomes the perfect tool for operations that require absolute discretion and absolute loyalty. The Minotaurs' relationship with their dreadnoughts reveals another disturbing aspect of their culture. In most Space Marine chapters, warriors entombed in dreadnought armor are treated with profound reverence, honored as living legends whose wisdom and experience are treasured by their brothers. The Minotaurs, by contrast, treat their hecaton with cold indifference, viewing them as weapons rather than honored ancients. This suggests a chapter that values utility over sentiment, that sees even its own heroes as mere tools to be deployed and expended as the situation requires. This utilitarian mindset extends to how they view casualties and losses. As the Minotaurs are willing to accept tremendous casualties if doing so achieves their objectives. They engage in wars of attrition with a coldness that disturbs even other Space Marines, trading lives for ground, accepting losses that would cause most chapters to withdraw and regroup. And yet, remarkably, they seem to have no difficulty maintaining their numbers. Observers note that they are almost always at or near full chapter strength, with recruitment and training processes that are remarkably swift compared to other chapters. This rapid recruitment and replacement has led to speculation about the methods the Minotaurs employ. Some suggest they use hypno-indoctrination and neurocerebral surgery more extensively than is typically acceptable, programming their recruits rather than truly training them, say, creating warriors who are perhaps more machine than man. Others point to the possibility that they recruit from Terra itself, enjoying access to the billions of potential candidates on humanity's throne world, a privilege that would explain both their numbers and their absolute loyalty to the High Lords. There are even darker theories, whispers about engrammatically enforced personalities and memories, about the possibility that at least some Minotaurs, perhaps including their chapter master, are not truly individuals, but rather constructs, warriors who have had personalities and memories artificially imposed upon them to create perfect soldiers. Such technology is considered heretical by the Adeptus Mechanicus. But it would not be the first time that the High Lords had sanctioned the use of forbidden methods for purposes deemed sufficiently important. Whatever the truth of their creation and maintenance, the Minotaurs present to the Imperium a unified face of bronze contempt. They do not seek alliances with other chapters. They do not participate in the social structures that bind most Space Marines together. They do not share intelligence, coordinate operations, or offer assistance, except when ordered to do so by their masters on Terra. They are islands unto themselves, connected to the broader Imperium only through their link to the High Lords, sufficient unto their own purposes, and dismissive of anyone who questions their methods. This isolation might be a weakness for another chapter, but for the Minotaurs it is a strength. That they cannot be turned against their masters through appeals to brotherhood or honor, because they recognize no brotherhood beyond their own ranks. They cannot be manipulated through politics or diplomacy, because they engage in neither. They are, in every sense, the perfect instrument of tyranny, powerful, obedient, and completely indifferent to the opinions or pleading of those they are sent to destroy. The executioner's arsenal. If the Minotaurs are the Emperor's executioners, then their weapons are the tools of that terrible trade, and examining what they carry into battle reveals as much about their purpose as any study of their tactics or their history. For a chapter supposedly descended from the cursed founding, supposedly isolated and self-sufficient, the Minotaurs possess an arsenal that should be impossible for them to maintain. Whereas they field equipment that other chapters must beg for centuries to receive, weapons and armor patterns that are supposed to be reserved for the Imperium's most favored forces, technology that suggests connections to Mars and Terra far deeper than any normal relationship between a Space Marine chapter and the Mechanicus. Begin with their armor. The Minotaurs possess extensive stocks of Mark 8 errant armor, one of the most advanced power armor patterns available to the Adeptus Astartes. This armor incorporates lessons learned from 10,000 years of warfare, featuring improved protection for vulnerable neck and shoulder areas, better integrated life support systems, and enhanced mobility compared to older marks. Most chapters have only limited access to Mark 8, using it primarily for their veterans and specialists. The Minotaurs, bought by contrast, field it across their entire chapter, equipping even their rank-and-file warriors with armor that would be considered a privilege in other organizations. But their advantages do not stop there. The chapter possesses sufficient stocks of Terminator armor to equip the majority of their first company, an achievement that speaks to resources far beyond what a typical chapter could muster. Terminator armor is precious beyond measure, each suit a masterwork of artifice that takes decades or even centuries to produce. Most chapters guard these suits as sacred relics, deploying them only in the most dire circumstances. The Minotaurs deploy them routinely, fielding entire formations of Terminators in battles where other chapters would make do with standard power armor, and not just standard Terminator armor either. Is the Minotaurs have access to rare variants that should be far beyond their reach. They field Tartaros pattern suits, a lighter, more mobile variant designed during the Great Crusade and now considered almost extinct. They deploy Arcanak pattern armor, another relic from the Emperor's Wars of Unification. These are not merely old suits maintained through careful preservation. They are supplied in such numbers that the Minotaurs can afford to deploy them in combat, to risk them in battle, suggesting that someone with access to the deepest armories of Mars or Terra has been equipping this chapter for purposes unknown. Their vehicle park is equally impressive, equally inexplicable. The Minotaurs field squadrons of Spartan assault tanks, massive vehicles designed to deliver entire squads of Terminators into the heart of enemy formations. These tanks are incredibly rare in the 41st Millennium, relics of the Great Crusade that most chapters can no longer produce or maintain. Yet the Minotaurs deploy them in sufficient numbers to mount sustained armored operations, suggesting either that they have access to standard template constructs for their production, or that someone has been manufacturing them specifically for this chapter's use. They possess more Typhon-heavy siege tanks than any other chapter in the Imperium. These massive vehicles, mounting Dreadhammer siege cannons that can reduce fortifications to rubble, are typically found only in the arsenals of the most established and powerful chapters. The fact that the Minotaurs, supposedly a chapter of questionable lineage and mysterious origins, have fielded them in such numbers is yet another indication of patronage from the highest levels of imperial authority. Perhaps most remarkable of all is their possession of at least 10 Contemptor pattern dreadnoughts active at the same time. Contemptor dreadnoughts are artifacts from the Great Crusade, advanced walker platforms that are superior in every way to the more common Castroferrum pattern that most chapters use. They are faster, stronger, better protected, and equipped with weapon systems that have been lost to the Imperium for thousands of years. Most chapters are lucky to possess a single Contemptor, preserved through millennia of careful maintenance and deployed only in the most crucial battles. The Minotaurs field 10 or more simultaneously, treating them as standard equipment rather than irreplaceable relics. The chapter even possesses its own variant of the Storm Eagle gunship, a modified pattern specifically designed for their use. Storm Eagles themselves are rare enough, advanced aircraft capable of delivering entire squads deep into enemy territory while providing massive fire support. A custom variant suggests that the Minotaurs not only have access to these aircraft, but have the influence to commission modifications to suit their specific tactical preferences. A level of customization typically reserved for first founding chapters or those with the strongest connections to the Mechanicus. And then there is the Black Spear, the weapon wielded by Chapter Master Asterion Moloch himself, an artifact that may be the most telling piece of equipment the Minotaurs possess. The Black Spear is described as similar to weapons used by the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, warriors whose equipment represents the pinnacle of what the Imperium can produce. It is a power weapon of remarkable potency, capable of piercing even Terminator armor with ease, and it incorporates a single-shot laser weapon powerful enough to destroy tanks. The similarities to custodian weapons are too specific to be coincidental. The Black Spear combines a power blade with an integrated energy weapon in exactly the manner of a Guardian's Spear, the signature weapon of the Custodes. The fact that a Space Marine chapter possesses such a weapon, that their chapter master carries into battle something that appears to be descended from or inspired by the arms of the Emperor's chosen guardians, and suggests connections that should not exist, relationships that go far beyond the normal interaction between the Adeptus Astartes and the forces of Terra. Some have speculated that the Black Spear was a gift from the Custodes themselves, a mark of favor or perhaps a symbol of alliance. Others suggest it might have been stolen or recovered from some ancient battlefield. The Minotaurs, of course, offer no explanation, treating the weapon's origins as yet another secret to be guarded jealously. But its existence, combined with the chapter's other equipment advantages, paints a picture of a force that operates with the explicit support and approval of powers at the very highest levels of imperial authority. This arsenal serves the Minotaur's tactical doctrine perfectly. They are not a chapter that favors finesse or subtle operations. They are a hammer, designed to smash through opposition through superior firepower and overwhelming force. Their tactics revolve around pinning enemies in place with vanguard elements, then encircling them with fast-moving units before bringing the full weight of their heavy armor and terminators to bear in devastating assaults that leave nothing standing. But the true purpose of their arsenal becomes clear when one considers their primary targets. Other Space Marine chapters are among the most heavily armored, most resilient warriors in the Imperium. They fight from fortified positions, wear power armor that can turn aside most weapons, and operate with tactical sophistication that makes them nearly impossible to defeat through conventional means. To fight them effectively, one needs not just superior numbers but superior equipment, and weapons and armor that can match or exceed what the enemy fields. The Minotaurs possess exactly this advantage. When they assault a fortified Space Marine position, They bring Typhon siege tanks to reduce the fortifications. When they engage enemy forces in close combat, they field Terminators in Tartaros and Arcanak patterns that can match anything their opponents can deploy. When they need to break through defensive lines, they use Spartan tanks to deliver assault squads directly into the heart of enemy formations. They fight their fellow Space Marines with every advantage that resources and patronage can provide, ensuring that when the bronze-clad warriors arrive, they arrive not just with determination, but with material superiority that makes resistance ultimately futile. Yet the message sent by this arsenal is as important as its tactical utility. The Minotaurs' equipment tells every other Space Marine chapter in the Imperium that they are not the High Lord's only warriors, not the Imperium's only defenders. It demonstrates that Terra maintains its own forces, better equipped than most chapters could ever hope to be, ready to be deployed against any who step out of line. It is a reminder, forged in blessed steel and ancient technology, that the autonomy Space Marine chapters enjoy exists only at the sufferance of those who rule from the throne world, and that this sufferance can be withdrawn at any moment. Lords of the Labyrinth, the High Lord's connection. To understand the Minotaurs fully, one must understand their relationship with the High Lords of Terra, at the 12 individuals who rule the Imperium in the Emperor's name. This connection is the key to every mystery about the chapter, the explanation for their unusual equipment, their sealed records, their immunity from investigation, and their unique role within the Imperium's vast military apparatus. The Minotaurs do not serve the Imperium in the abstract. They serve specific masters, and those masters wield power that few can comprehend. The Senatorum Imperialis, to give the High Lords their formal title, occupy a position unique in the imperial hierarchy. They are not elected, not chosen through any democratic process. They hold their seats through a combination of institutional authority and personal power, representing the most powerful organizations and interests within the Imperium. The Master of the Administratum is who oversees the vast bureaucracy that governs humanity's million worlds. The Fabricator General of Mars, who speaks for the Adeptus Mechanicus and controls the Imperium's technological infrastructure. The Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum, who commands the Emperor's personal killers. The Ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Ministorum, who leads the imperial cult and shapes the faith of trillions. These are beings who speak and worlds tremble, whose slightest word can condemn planets to exterminatus or grant prosperity to entire sectors. They are, in every practical sense, the rulers of humanity, exercising powers that the Emperor himself once wielded, making decisions that affect the lives of countless billions. And they are, by the very nature of their position, paranoid beyond measure. Whilst they sit at the apex of a pyramid of power so vast that it spans the galaxy, yet their authority is constantly threatened. Below them, thousands of organizations and individuals scheme and plot, seeking to expand their own power at the expense of others. Rogue traders carve out private empires in the distant darkness. Imperial commanders build personal armies and forget their oaths of loyalty. Even other High Lords plot against each other, forming alliances and engaging in political warfare that can reshape the Imperium's governance. And most dangerous of all are the Space Marines themselves. These gene-forged warriors, created by the Emperor to be humanity's defenders, possess power that makes them nearly independent actors. Each chapter is a self-sustaining military force of 1,000 warriors who can defeat armies, who answer to no authority but their own chapter masters, who guard their autonomy jealously and resist any attempt at external control. The High Lords must depend on these warriors for the Imperium's defense, yet they cannot fully control them, cannot ensure their absolute loyalty, cannot be certain that these superhuman warriors will not one day turn their weapons against Terra itself. The Horus Heresy proved that this fear is not paranoia, but prudent caution. Half the Space Marine legions turned traitor, led by the Emperor's own favored son. The galaxy burned for 7 years as brother fought brother, and the Imperium came within a hair's breadth of total annihilation. The memory of that betrayal has never faded, not in 10,000 years. It haunts every decision the High Lords make regarding the Adeptus Astartes, colors every policy, as shapes every interaction. The second founding, which broke the legions into smaller chapters, was an attempt to limit the power any single Space Marine force could wield. But even divided, the Adeptus Astartes remain dangerous. 1,000 warriors may not be able to conquer the Imperium, but they can certainly rebel, can certainly resist, can certainly make themselves into a problem that requires tremendous resources to solve. And there are 1,000 such chapters scattered across the galaxy, each with its own culture, its own traditions, its own interpretation of loyalty and duty. How then do the High Lords maintain control? How do they ensure that these superhuman warriors remain servants rather than masters? They employ many tools: political manipulation, careful distribution of resources, the Inquisition's watchful eye, the chaplains who maintain ideological purity. But sometimes these tools are insufficient. Sometimes a chapter goes rogue, refuses orders, pursues its own agenda in defiance of Terra's will. Sometimes the soft power of politics and religion fails, and hard power becomes necessary. Enter the Minotaurs. The relationship between the chapter and the High Lords operates entirely outside normal Imperial command structures. Most Space Marine chapters receive their orders through a complex web of authorities: segmentum commanders, sector governors, inquisitorial mandates, requests for aid from threatened worlds. The Minotaurs receive their orders directly from the Senatorum Imperialis, bypassing every intermediate layer of authority. When the High Lords decide a target must be engaged, they send word to the Minotaurs, and the chapter responds with a speed and efficiency that suggests they exist in a state of constant readiness, waiting only for the command to deploy. This direct line of communication and control is unprecedented for a Space Marine chapter. It grants the Minotaurs autonomy that other chapters can only dream of, freedom to ignore requests from other Imperial authorities, permission to refuse cooperation with other forces if they deem it unnecessary. But it also places them in a position of absolute dependence on the High Lord's continued favor. Their special status exists only as long as they serve faithfully, only as long as they prove their worth as executioners and enforcers. The evidence of this special relationship is everywhere in the chapter's operations. The Minotaurs possess resources that can only come from the highest levels of Imperial authority. Their equipment, as discussed earlier, suggests access to armories that should be beyond the reach of any non-first founding chapter. Their recruitment seems to operate outside normal restrictions, allowing them to maintain full strength despite casualties that would cripple other chapters. Their gene seed tithes are sealed under edicts that bear the mark of the High Lords themselves, preventing even the Inquisition from examining them to determine the chapter's true genetic heritage. But perhaps the most telling evidence is how the Minotaurs are deployed. Analysis of their campaigns over the past several thousand years reveals a pattern. They are sent almost exclusively against targets that threaten the High Lord's control over the Adeptus Astartes, renegade chapters that refuse to submit to authority, Space Marines who have formed dangerous alliances or built power bases independent of Terra, chapters embroiled in conflicts with each other where the fighting threatens to spread and destabilize entire regions. The Badab War, which we will examine in detail shortly, exemplifies this perfectly. When Luft Huron and his Astral Claws rebelled against the authority of the Administratum, when 3 other chapters sided with him and the Maelstrom Zone threatened to break away from Imperial control, the Minotaurs were deployed to crush the rebellion and restore order. They fought with a brutality that shocked even other loyalist chapters, demonstrating to everyone watching exactly what happens to Space Marines who defy the High Lord's will. Similarly, during the suppression of the Macarian heresy, the Minotaurs were deployed specifically to deal with Space Marine chapters that had become locked in conflict with each other. The Euxine incident, where they nearly destroyed both the Doom Warriors and the Inceptors, served as a stark reminder that the High Lords would not tolerate Space Marines fighting each other when their services were needed elsewhere. The message was clear: serve the Imperium's interests as defined by terror, or face destruction at the hands of brothers who will not hesitate to pull the trigger. This arrangement serves the High Lord's interests perfectly, but it also creates enormous resentment among other Space Marine chapters. The Ultramarines, and their successors in particular, have forbidden the Minotaurs from entering Ultramar, the 500 worlds that serve as their domain. This ban stems from multiple incidents where the Minotaurs showed contempt for Ultramarines' traditions and violated what the Sons of Guilliman consider basic standards of honor and brotherhood. The chapter has publicly insulted Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, and one of the most respected Space Marines in the Imperium. They have provoked the Genesis chapter, a second founding successor of the Ultramarines, nearly coming to blows before external threats forced them to cooperate. Most damningly, they almost completely destroyed the Inceptors chapter, another Ultramarine successor, stripping them of their relics and their flagship as spoils of war, reducing a proud second founding chapter to fewer than 100 warriors in a display of ruthless efficiency that shocked the entire Adeptus Astartes. Other chapters view the Minotaurs with similar distrust and hatred. The Red Scorpions, known for their rigid adherence to purity and honor, have had tense encounters with the bronze-clad executioners. The Crimson Fists, still recovering from their near destruction during the Battle of Rindsworld, watched warily as the Minotaurs deployed to their homeworld, uncertain whether these supposed allies might turn on them if given the slightest excuse. Even chapters that have fought alongside the Minotaurs speak of the experience with something approaching trauma. Imperial commanders report that the chapter's security protocols border on paranoia, that they treat even nominal allies as potential threats, that they share no information beyond the absolute minimum required for coordination. The few Space Marines who have served in joint operations with the Minotaurs describe warriors who show contempt for concepts like honor and brotherhood, who view other Adeptus Astartes as either obstacles to be overcome or resources to be exploited. Yet for all this resentment, for all the hatred the Minotaurs have earned through their methods and their attitude, no chapter has moved openly against them. The reason is simple. Everyone understands what the Minotaurs represent. To attack them would be to attack the High Lords themselves, to declare oneself in rebellion against the ultimate authority in the Imperium. Any chapter that made such a move would immediately find itself declared traitor, would face not just the Minotaurs, but the full might of Imperial forces deployed to ensure their destruction. The Minotaurs, in this sense, are more than just a weapon. They are a symbol, a reminder, a threat that hangs over every Space Marine chapter in the Imperium. They prove that the High Lords have the means to enforce their will, that they maintain forces specifically designed to deal with renegade Adeptus Astartes, that no chapter is so powerful or so respected that it cannot be brought to heel if it steps too far from the path of obedience. This was demonstrated most dramatically during the Hexarchy incident in the closing years of the 41st Millennium. As several corrupt High Lords attempted to stage a coup against the returned Primarch Roboute Guilliman, sapping resources and deploying forces for their own political ends. The Minotaurs were brought to terror as part of this plot, deployed for anti-cultist operations, but clearly intended to serve as muscle for the conspirators' power grab. When the coup collapsed and the corrupt High Lords were executed by the Adeptus Custodes, the Minotaurs found themselves in a precarious position, their patrons dead and their purpose suddenly uncertain. Asterion Moloch, their chapter master, prepared the chapter for battle, ready to fight even the Emperor's own custodians if that was what service to the High Lords demanded. But the new master of the Administratum, Violetta Roscavla, whispered something in Moloch's ear, as some word or phrase that made him withdraw the chapter immediately, abandoning terror without resistance. What was said has never been revealed, but the implications are clear. The Minotaurs serve not individual High Lords, but the office itself, the institution of ultimate authority in the Imperium. When the corrupt lords were replaced with new ones, the Minotaurs transferred their loyalty seamlessly, demonstrating that their obedience runs to structure rather than persons, to the concept of authority rather than individual authority figures. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their relationship with the High Lords. The Minotaurs are not men who have chosen to serve power. They are weapons programmed to serve it, unable to question, unable to resist, unable to conceive of any existence beyond their role as executioners for whatever masters currently sit upon the council. They are the labyrinth's monster made manifest, trapped within structures they cannot escape, serving purposes they may not even fully understand, consuming those sent to face them in an endless cycle of violence and obedience. Asterion Moloch, the brazen warlord, at the heart of the Minotaurs chapter, commanding from his brazen throne aboard the heavy assault carrier Daedalus Crater, sits a figure who embodies everything his chapter represents. Asterion Moloch, known by titles that speak to both his power and his reputation. Master of the Minotaurs, satrap of the Daedalus Crater, bringer of wrath, the brazen warlord, spear of judgment. His name is spoken in whispers across the Imperium, as a byword for slaughter and destruction carried out with methodical precision, a legend that grows darker with each campaign he leads. But who is Asterion Moloch? Is he a man, a warrior whose skill and dedication have earned him the right to lead one of the Imperium's most feared chapters? Or is he something else entirely, something constructed rather than born, a legacy maintained through technology that borders on the heretical? The question haunts those few brave or foolish enough to investigate the Minotaurs, and the answers, such as they are, only deepen the mystery. What can be stated with certainty is that the being known as Asterion Moloch is a formidable combatant by any measure. Standing tall even among space marines, clad in Tartaros pattern Terminator armor of exceptional craftsmanship, he cuts a figure that dominates any battlefield he enters. His armor is covered with the scars of countless engagements, its bronze surface marked with battle damage that speaks to wars fought across the breadth of the Imperium. Upon his shoulders rests a storm shield bearing the heraldry of the Minotaurs, marked with those ancient Terran Helak glyphs that resist translation into any modern tongue. In his hands, he carries the black spear, that weapon of unknown provenance that may have once belonged to the Adeptus Custodes themselves. The spear is a masterwork of artifice, its blade capable of piercing even Terminator armor, its integrated laser weapon powerful enough to destroy tanks with a single shot. Moloch wields it with a skill that suggests countless hours of training, and driving it through enemy champions with precision that leaves no room for defense or counterattack. But it is not his equipment that makes Moloch truly dangerous, nor even his combat prowess, impressive though that may be. What makes him terrifying is his mind, the cold, calculating intelligence that has made him perhaps the most effective chapter master in the Imperium when it comes to the systematic destruction of other Space Marine forces. He is a master of siegecraft and attrition warfare, capable of breaking any defense through the ruthless application of superior firepower and tactical sophistication. He understands how Space Marines think, how they fight, how they react to pressure and threat, and he uses this understanding to dismantle them piece by piece. Outside of battle, Moloch can be found in the labyrinthine chambers, at the heart of the Daedalus Crater, surrounded by data feeds and tabulation servitors, analyzing casualty reports and tactical assessments with obsessive attention to detail. He measures the drops of blood spilt in pursuit of his chapter's strategic goals, tracking the progress of campaigns through statistics and projections, treating war as a problem to be solved through superior logistics and planning, rather than heroic action. This analytical approach extends to how he views his own forces. Moloch is not a chapter master who leads from the front out of a desire for personal glory. He fights alongside his Terminators because that is the most efficient deployment of his combat capabilities, because his presence at the point of contact can make the difference between victory and defeat. And he calculates acceptable casualty rates with the same cold precision he applies to everything else. willing to spend lives if doing so achieves objectives that advance his chapter's mission. His reputation among other Space Marines is one of the darkest in the Imperium. He has personally slain multiple renegade chapter masters, cutting them down in single combat with the Black Spear. He has destroyed Orc war bosses, Eldar Corsair princes, champions of the Dark Gods, each death adding to a tally that would make him a legendary hero in any other chapter. But Moloch takes no joy in these victories, shows no pride in his achievements. He simply moves to the next target, the next campaign, the next execution. The few accounts of Moloch attending war councils describe a chapter master who has little patience for diplomacy or coordination. He rarely appears in person, preferring to send his reclusiarch, Ivanus Encomi, to represent the chapter in such gatherings. When he does participate, he shows open contempt for the concerns of other commanders, making it clear that he considers the Minotaurs sufficient unto themselves, that he neither wants nor needs input from allies who might complicate his tactical plans with their moral qualms or political considerations. This arrogance would be unbearable if it were not backed by consistent results. Moloch has never failed in a mission given to him by the High Lords. He has broken chapters that thought themselves invincible, reduced fortresses deemed impregnable to rubble, hunted renegades across multiple star systems until they had nowhere left to run. And his efficiency is such that when the High Lords need a problem solved without mercy or hesitation, they send the Minotaurs, confident that Moloch will achieve the desired outcome regardless of cost. But here is where the mystery deepens, where the questions about Moloch's nature become impossible to ignore. The being known as Asterion Moloch has been reported killed in action at least 7 times over the past 5 centuries, only to reappear months or years later, commanding the Minotaurs as if nothing had happened. During the Orphean War, he was vented into space during a boarding action against a Necron tomb ship, his body subjected to damage that should have killed even a space marine multiple times over. He was declared missing, presumed dead, and remained so for some time before reappearing to lead his chapter in subsequent campaigns. How does one explain this? The most obvious answer would be that the reports of his death were mistaken, that he survived through luck or the intervention of his warriors. But the pattern repeats too often for this explanation to be satisfactory. 7 times in 500 years, Moloch has been reported killed, and 7 times he has returned. No amount of luck or skill can account for such a survival rate. This has led to a theory that strikes at the heart of what it means to be a space marine, what it means to be an individual rather than a role. Some observers have suggested that Asterion Moloch is not one person, but many, that the name and the position are passed down from warrior to warrior as each dies, with the new chapter master taking on not just the title, but the identity of his predecessor. This alone would be unusual, but not unprecedented. Many chapters have traditions of passing names and equipment down through generations. But the theory goes further. It suggests that when a new Moloch is chosen, he undergoes a process called the Proteus Protocol, where memories and personality traits are engrammatically enforced, artificially imposed upon his mind through technology that borders on the heretical. The new chapter master would not just take Moloch's name, he would become Moloch, his own identity subsumed beneath layers of programmed memory and artificially constructed personality, transformed into a continuation of the same being that has led the Minotaurs for centuries. If this theory is true, and there is circumstantial evidence to support it beyond just the survival pattern, then Asterion Moloch represents something unprecedented and deeply disturbing in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. He would not be a man, but a construct, a legacy maintained through technology, a personality that has been copied and imposed and maintained across multiple bodies and lifetimes. Each Moloch would remember the previous Moloch's experiences, would carry his hatreds and his loyalties, would continue his work as if death had been merely an interruption rather than an ending. The implications are staggering. If the Proteus Protocol exists, if personalities can be imposed and maintained in this way, then what does it say about the Minotaurs as a whole? How many of them are truly individuals? And how many are constructs? Warriors who have had identities and loyalties programmed into them to create the perfect servants of the High Lord's will. The rapid recruitment and training that keeps the chapter at full strength. The hypno-indoctrination and neurocerebral surgery that observers have noted. All of this could be part of a larger program to create warriors who are less human and more machine, less brothers and more weapons. This would explain Moloch's cold efficiency, his lack of emotional connection to anything beyond his mission. If he is not truly one person, but a role being performed by a succession of programmed individuals, then his inhuman dedication makes terrible sense. He's not fighting to prove himself, or to earn glory, or to protect humanity because he loves it. He fights because that is what he was created to do, as because his artificial memories tell him this is his purpose, because the programming that defines him allows for nothing else. The truth, as always with the Minotaurs, remains hidden behind layers of secrecy and classification. But whether Moloch is one man, many men, or something in between, he remains the personification of everything his chapter represents. He is ruthless, where others might show mercy, calculating where others might act on emotion, absolutely loyal, where others might question or resist. He is the ultimate weapon, pointed at the enemies of the High Lords and unleashed without hesitation or regret. And in the darkness of the 41st millennium, where questions of identity and humanity have long since been subordinated to the demands of survival and service. But perhaps it no longer matters whether Asterion Moloch is a man or a role, whether he chooses his actions or has them programmed into him. What matters is that he exists, that he leads, that he kills with mechanical efficiency anything and anyone marked for destruction by the powers that rule from terror. The brazen warlord sits upon his throne, surrounded by the instruments of war and the calculations of death, and the galaxy trembles at his approach. The Badab War. Trial by blood. In the annals of imperial history, few conflicts have been as shameful or as necessary as the Badab War, a civil war that pitted Space Marine against Space Marine, brother against brother, in a struggle that would define the Minotaurs' reputation and establish them as the High Lord's executioners beyond any doubt. This was the campaign where the bronze-clad warriors would show the Imperium exactly what they were capable of, where their methods would be tested against some of the finest Space Marines in existence, and where they would prove that when it came to destroying their own kind, no chapter could match their ruthless efficiency. The war began, as such conflicts often do, with the best of intentions corrupted by pride and ambition. Luft Huron, chapter master of the Astral Claws, had been granted authority over the Maelstrom Zone, a region of space plagued by piracy, Xenos incursions, and the proximity to the Maelstrom itself, a massive warp storm that vomited Chaos Raiders into real space with terrifying regularity. Huron was tasked with defending this region, given command over several other chapters who would work together as the Maelstrom Warders, a coalition meant to protect Imperial interests and maintain order in this troubled area. For decades, the arrangement worked. The Maelstrom Warders, led by Huron's strategic brilliance, pushed back the pirates and Xenos, secured trade routes, stabilized the region. Wealth began to flow again from the Maelstrom Zone into the greater Imperium, and the success of this arrangement seemed to vindicate the decision to grant Huron such extensive authority. But success bred ambition, and ambition bred resentment when the Administratum began demanding higher tithes, treating the Maelstrom Zone's prosperity as an opportunity for exploitation rather than a security achievement. Huron refused to pay, arguing that the resources were needed to maintain the defenses that had created the prosperity in the first place. The Administratum responded by cutting off support and demanding compliance. Political tensions escalated into military confrontation as trade fleets were seized and imperial forces were deployed to enforce the tithes. And then, Huron made the fateful decision that would transform a tax dispute into full-scale civil war. He declared the Maelstrom Zone's independence from the Administratum's authority, issuing what he called the Articles of Just Succession. 3 other chapters sided with him. The Lamenters, cursed by terrible luck but bound to Huron by oaths of alliance. The Mantis warriors, who had fought alongside the Astral Claws for decades and refused to abandon their brothers. The Executioners, a chapter with its own grievances against the Administratum. Together, these secessionist chapters represented a formidable force, nearly 4,000 Space Marines prepared to defend their autonomy against whatever the Imperium sent against them. The High Lords could not allow this rebellion to succeed. If Huron was permitted to defy the Administratum's authority, if Space Marine chapters could simply declare independence whenever they disagreed with Terra's policies, then the entire structure of Imperial control over the Adeptus Astartes would collapse. Other chapters might follow Huron's example, carving out their own domains, refusing tithes, rejecting orders. The Imperium could fracture into 1,000 petty kingdoms ruled by transhuman warlords, exactly the nightmare scenario that the Second Founding had been designed to prevent. And so the order was given. The rebellion must be crushed, the secessionist chapters destroyed or brought to heel, the lesson taught in blood that no Space Marine chapter stands above the authority of Terra. Loyalist forces were assembled from across the Imperium, chapters volunteered or were commanded to deploy to the Maelstrom Zone, and a war began that would consume millions of lives and reshape the region for generations to come. The Minotaurs entered this conflict in the year 907 of the 41st Millennium, arriving as part of a wave of reinforcements that signaled the High Lord's determination to end the rebellion regardless of cost. They deployed at full chapter strength, bringing their entire force of nearly 1,000 warriors, supported by their fleet of more than a dozen strike cruisers and battle barges. As from the moment they arrived, it was clear that these were not ordinary reinforcements, not another chapter sent to bolster the loyalist cause. These were executioners, sent to deliver a message written in fire and blood. The Minotaurs operated largely independently throughout the campaign, coordinating their efforts with overall loyalist strategy, but refusing to submit to external tactical control. They chose their own targets, prosecuted their own operations, and demonstrated a level of autonomy that would have been unthinkable for most chapters. But the High Lords had given them this freedom, had essentially unleashed them upon the secessionists with instructions to destroy resistance by any means necessary, and destroy they did. The Minotaurs gained fame, or perhaps infamy, for their cold-blooded and merciless attacks on secessionist forces. They gave no quarter, accepted no surrender, showed no mercy to those who resisted them. Civilian casualties meant nothing to them. If destroying a city would achieve their objectives, the city was destroyed. If reducing a planet to ash would eliminate secessionist support, the planet was burned. They were, in the assessment of other loyalist commanders, the preeminent close combat and shock assault troops in the war, at least until the arrival of the even more savage Carcharodons. But it was their complete defeat of the Lamenters chapter that would define the Minotaurs' reputation for generations to come, that would establish them as the ultimate Brotherhood killers, the chapter that other Space Marines feared more than any Xenos or heretic enemy. Yet the Lamenters had fought well throughout the war, but they had never fully committed to Huron's rebellion, had refused to fire on their former allies the Marines errant, despite being on opposite sides, had tried to maintain some sense of honor and brotherhood, even while fighting for the secessionist cause. The Minotaurs cared nothing for such distinctions. They hunted the Lamenters across multiple systems, tracking their fleet with relentless patience, studying their tactics and dispositions, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, when the Minotaurs located the Lamenters' chapter bark Mater Lacrimarum in the Optera system, they sprang their trap with devastating efficiency. They crippled the Mater Lacrimarum's engines with a surgical strike, leaving the battle barge unable to flee. The Lamenters, unwilling to abandon their mobile fortress monastery, their home among the stars, rushed to its defense with their full strength. This was exactly what the Minotaurs had planned for. The Lamenters found themselves fighting not a mobile engagement where their tactical flexibility could be employed, but a grinding battle of attrition in close quarters. exactly the kind of warfare where the Minotaurs excelled. What followed was 17 hours of vicious boarding actions and close-quarter battles, Space Marine against Space Marine in the corridors and chambers of warships, fighting with bolt and blade in environments where there was no room for maneuver, no possibility of retreat. The Minotaurs pressed forward with inexorable determination, accepting casualties that would have caused other chapters to withdraw, trading lives for ground with a coldness that shocked even the battle-hardened Lamenters. The battle was fought across multiple vessels in the void and on the surface of Optera 5 below, the Minotaurs coordinating their assault with precision that suggested they had wargamed exactly this scenario, had prepared specifically for the task of destroying another Space Marine chapter in ship-to-ship combat. They employed their Terminators in the tight confines where their superior armor would tell, used their assault units to overwhelm isolated defenders, brought their heavy weapons to bear in kill zones that turned sections of the ships into abattoirs. The Lamenters fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant the end of their chapter, perhaps their execution as traitors. Yet they called upon every ounce of skill and determination they possessed, fighting as only Space Marines can fight when everything is at stake. But skill and determination were not enough against an enemy that possessed every material advantage, every tactical edge, every blessing of superior equipment and resources. After 17 hours of combat, the Lamenters had been reduced to barely 300 warriors, most of them wounded. Their ships were wrecked or captured, their gene seed stores seized, their chapter bark claimed by the Minotaurs as a prize of war. They had fought to the edge of extinction, and now they faced a choice: die to the last man, or surrender and hope for mercy from an Imperium that had little reason to grant it. They surrendered. The remaining Lamenters laid down their weapons, submitted to captivity, and prayed that their actions during the war would be weighed against their association with Huron's rebellion. The Minotaurs accepted this surrender with cold efficiency, securing the prisoners and beginning the systematic looting of the Lamenters' ships. They stripped every relic, every piece of sacred war gear, every item of value from the defeated chapter, claiming them as spoils of war. The Lamenters' battle barge, Daughter of Tempests, was added to the Minotaurs' own fleet. Ancient weapons and armor, artifacts that had served the Lamenters since their founding, were taken to equip the victors. This act of appropriation, this stripping of a defeated chapter's heritage, shocked other Space Marines almost as much as the battle itself. There are traditions, even in war, customs that are supposed to govern how Space Marines treat their defeated brothers. The Minotaurs ignored all of them, treating the Lamenters not as fallen comrades to be honored even in defeat, but as enemies to be plundered, resources to be exploited. The message sent by this victory echoed across the Imperium. The Minotaurs had demonstrated that they could defeat other Space Marines, that they could hunt them across star systems, that they could crush them in battle through superior resources and ruthless tactics. They had shown that concepts like honor and brotherhood meant nothing when set against the imperative of obedience to the High Lords, and they had proven that no chapter, no matter how skilled or determined, could hope to stand against them if the orders came from Terra. The Minotaurs spent the rest of the war conducting interdiction operations and carrying out punitive raids against former secessionist worlds, their role shifting from shock assault troops to occupation forces once the back of the rebellion had been broken. They had suffered significant casualties in the battle against the Lamenters, but nothing that would prevent them from continuing operations, nothing that suggested their strength had been seriously depleted. When the Badab War finally ended with the fall of Badab Primaris and Huron's transformation into the Chaos Warlord, known as Huron Blackheart, the Minotaurs departed the Maelstrom Zone with their holds full of captured equipment and their reputation as executioners firmly established. They had proven their worth to the High Lords, and had demonstrated that they were willing and able to destroy other Space Marines without hesitation or remorse. They had become the knife that the Imperium held at the throat of every Space Marine chapter, the ultimate sanction that could be deployed against any who dared to rebel. And in the years that followed, Whenever Space Marines heard that the Minotaurs had been deployed to their region, whenever reports came of bronze-armored warriors arriving in a war zone, the reaction was always the same: fear, resentment, and the grim knowledge that someone, somewhere, had displeased the High Lords enough to warrant the attention of their executioners, masters of siege and slaughter. To understand how the Minotaurs achieved their terrible success, one must examine their methods of war, check the tactical doctrines and strategic approaches that make them so effective at their chosen specialty of destroying other Space Marines. These are not warriors who rely on heroic charges or individual glory. They are not brothers who fight with the righteous fury that characterizes most chapters. Instead, they approach warfare as a problem to be solved through superior logistics, overwhelming firepower, and the ruthless application of attrition tactics that grind down even the most determined resistance. The foundation of Minotaur's tactics is their consistent deployment at full chapter strength. Unlike most Space Marine organizations, which spread their forces across multiple war zones to respond to various threats simultaneously, the Minotaurs fight as a single unified hammer. They deploy with nearly 1,000 warriors, supported by their entire fleet, bringing to bear a concentration of force that few enemies can hope to match. This makes them inflexible in some ways, unable to respond to multiple crises at once, but it also makes them nearly unstoppable when they focus their attention on a single target. This approach reflects the Iron Warrior's legacy that may lie at the heart of their gene seed, echoing Perturabo's doctrine of overwhelming force applied with mechanical precision. The Minotaurs do not seek elegant solutions or clever stratagems. They identify the enemy's position, calculate the force required to crush it, and then apply that force without mercy or hesitation. If the initial assault is insufficient, they bring more warriors, more firepower, more resources to bear until resistance collapses beneath the weight of their attack. Their specialty in siege warfare and attrition combat serves this approach perfectly. The Minotaurs excel at reducing fortifications, at breaking defensive positions, at prosecuting campaigns where victory is measured not in decisive battles, but in the slow, methodical destruction of enemy capability to resist. They will lay siege to a fortress and pound it with artillery for weeks if necessary, accepting the time cost because they know that eventually the walls will crack and the defenders will break. This patience is perhaps their most dangerous quality. Many Space Marine chapters fight with a sense of urgency, driven by the need to achieve victory quickly and move on to the next crisis. The Minotaurs can afford to take their time, secure in the knowledge that they will not be pulled away to respond to other threats, that the High Lords have given them this target and will not reassign them until it has been destroyed. This allows them to prosecute campaigns with a thoroughness that other chapters cannot match, to eliminate not just the immediate threat, but any possibility of its resurgence. When engaging other Space Marines, the Minotaurs employ tactics specifically designed to negate the advantages that make the Adeptus Astartes so dangerous. Space Marines are mobile, capable of rapid redeployment and hit-and-run tactics. The Minotaurs counter this by deploying vanguard forces to pin enemies in place, using their own fast-moving units and superior numbers to create encirclements that prevent escape. Once the enemy is fixed in position, they bring their heavy armor and terminators to bear in assaults that crush resistance through sheer weight of firepower and superior equipment. Space Marines are resilient, capable of fighting even when outnumbered or outgunned through superior skill and determination. The Minotaurs counter this by engaging in wars of attrition, trading casualties at rates that would horrify other chapters, accepting losses because they know they can replace them and their enemies cannot. A Minotaur squad that suffers 50% casualties in taking an objective is considered to have performed adequately if the objective is secured. The warriors are weapons, to be expended as the situation requires, and there are always more being trained to take their place. Space Marines fight with honor and brotherhood, the concepts that create both strength and vulnerability. The Minotaurs exploit this vulnerability ruthlessly, striking at sacred sites, targeting chapter leadership, employing tactics that other Space Marines would consider beyond the pale. They have no compunction about destroying cultural artifacts or historical relics if doing so damages enemy morale. They will execute prisoners if it serves their purposes, betray truces if it grants them tactical advantage, employ any method necessary to achieve victory because they recognize no law beyond the orders given by the High Lords. This approach extends to their treatment of their own warriors. The Minotaurs maintain discipline through fear as much as through loyalty, with severe punishments for failure and no tolerance for weakness or hesitation. These warriors who fail in their duties are not given opportunities for redemption, but are relegated to penitent squads or simply executed, their gene seed harvested, and their service record erased. This creates a chapter where every warrior understands that their value exists only in their utility, that they are parts of a machine rather than individuals with inherent worth. Yet for all this coldness, the Minotaurs are not mindless automatons. They are capable of sophisticated tactical planning, of adapting to unexpected situations, of showing the initiative and creativity that mark the finest Space Marine forces. The difference is that this creativity is channeled entirely toward the mission, never diluted by concerns about honor or the welfare of allies or the broader moral implications of their actions. A Minotaur commander faced with a choice between achieving his objective and preserving civilian lives will choose the objective without hesitation. A Minotaur squad that could win through clever tactics or through simply overwhelming the enemy with firepower will choose firepower because it is more certain. This makes them predictable in some ways, but also makes them extremely difficult to defeat. An enemy who understands Minotaur's tactics knows what they will do. They will pin you in place, encircle you, and crush you with superior force. But knowing what they will do and being able to prevent it are very different things. The Minotaur's advantages in equipment and numbers mean that even when their enemies know exactly what's coming, they often lack the resources to stop it. The chapter's heavy use of Contemptor dreadnoughts, as those ancient war machines that they call Hecaton, serves as a perfect example of their approach, while other chapters treat dreadnoughts as honored ancients, deploying them carefully and protecting them as irreplaceable assets. The Minotaurs employ their Hecaton as shock troops, throwing them into the most dangerous engagements with a casualness that suggests they have access to replacement chassis and systems that other chapters cannot hope to acquire. The Hecaton advance into the teeth of enemy fire, their ancient weapons systems laying down devastating barrages, their durability allowing them to survive attacks that would destroy lesser vehicles. And if they are destroyed, well, there are always more where they came from. This same philosophy applies to their use of Terminators. Most chapters deploy Terminators sparingly, recognizing that each suit of tactical dreadnought armor represents a precious resource that took decades to produce. The Minotaurs field them in such numbers that they can afford to use them as line troops, as the core of their assault forces, rather than as elite specialists. During the Badab War, entire companies of Minotaurs Terminators were deployed in boarding actions, creating killing zones in the corridors of enemy ships, where nothing could stand against their combined firepower. Their vehicle doctrines follow similar principles. The Minotaurs possess extensive stocks of Vindicators, Predators, and Land Raiders, and they employ them en masse rather than in small supporting elements. A Minotaur's assault might be preceded by entire squadrons of Vindicators, yet their demolisher cannons reducing fortifications to rubble before the infantry even deploys. This creates kill zones that channel enemy movement, shapes the battlefield to favor the Minotaur's strengths, and ensures that when contact is made, it occurs on terms favorable to the attackers. But perhaps the most important aspect of their tactical approach is their complete lack of mercy or quarter once battle is joined. The Minotaurs do not accept surrenders in the field, do not take prisoners except when specifically ordered to do so by command, do not show any compassion to those who resist them. This is not sadism or cruelty in the traditional sense. They take no pleasure in causing suffering. It is simply efficient, a recognition that allowing enemies to surrender creates complications, requires resources for containment and processing, and potentially allows opponents to escape or regroup. This ruthlessness extends to how they treat non-combatants. If civilians are sheltering enemy forces, the civilians are acceptable casualties. If a city must be destroyed to eliminate resistance, the city is destroyed. If an entire world must burn to ensure that rebellion is stamped out completely, the world burns. The Minotaurs view such actions not as atrocities, but as necessary costs of warfare, as the price that must be paid to achieve the objectives set by the High Lords. This approach makes them extraordinarily effective, but also makes them pariahs among other Imperial forces. Few commanders want to work with the Minotaurs if they can avoid it, not just because of their methods, but because of their attitude toward anyone who questions those methods. The Minotaurs treat external commanders with barely concealed contempt, following orders from the High Lords while ignoring requests or suggestions from anyone else. They coordinate when they must, but never collaborate, never share intelligence beyond the minimum required, never adjust their tactics to accommodate the concerns of allies. In the end, the Minotaur's mastery of siege and slaughter comes down to a simple formula. Identify the target, apply overwhelming force, continue until resistance ceases. There is no elegance to it, no artistry, nothing that would inspire the battle hymns or heroic tales that other chapters treasure. It is warfare reduced to its most brutal essentials, combat as a problem of logistics and firepower rather than courage and skill. And it works, again and again and again, because in the grim darkness of the far future, elegance and honor matter less than the simple ability to destroy your enemies before they can destroy you. The Orphean War and beyond. The Badab War established the Minotaurs as the High Lord's executioners, but it was far from their only campaign, far from the only time they would demonstrate their terrible efficiency against the enemies of the Imperium. In the years that followed, the bronze-clad warriors would be deployed across the galaxy, fighting Xenos and heretics, and, most frequently, other space marines who had strayed from the path of absolute obedience to Terra's will. The Orphean War, fought in the closing years of the 41st Millennium against the resurgent Maynarch dynasty of Necrons, would test the Minotaurs in ways that the Badab War had not. Here, they faced not fellow space marines, but an enemy that was in many ways their antithesis, ancient beyond measure, implacable in their purpose, and absolutely without mercy or humanity. The Necrons of the Maynarch dynasty were masters of extermination, their Flayer virus creating legions of insane killers who wore the flayed skins of their victims, their weapons capable of stripping life from entire worlds with mechanical precision. The Minotaurs deployed to the Orpheus sector as part of a coalition of Imperial forces, arriving to find a situation that was rapidly deteriorating. The Necrons had awakened from their millennia-long slumber with appetites that could not be satisfied, their tomb worlds erupting with warriors that marched across human colonies like a plague of metal locusts. World after world fell to their advance, as populations harvested for purposes unknown, infrastructure destroyed with methodical thoroughness. Chapter Master Asterion Moloch served as Commander-in-Chief of the Space Marine forces deployed to counter this threat, a role that suited his talents perfectly. He approached the war against the Necrons with the same cold calculation he brought to every conflict, analyzing their tactics and dispositions, identifying weaknesses to be exploited, marshalling Imperial forces with the efficiency of a siege master preparing to reduce a fortress. The campaign was brutal even by the Minotaurs' standards. The Necrons fought without fear or hesitation, their warriors rising again even after being destroyed, their technology superior to anything the Imperium could field. But the Minotaurs met them with a stubbornness that matched their own implacability, engaging in grinding battles of attrition where neither side would yield, where victory was measured in the slow accumulation of minor advantages rather than decisive breakthroughs. The climax came during the Battle of Amara Prime, a void engagement that would see Moloch lead a desperate boarding action against the Necron flagship Deadhand. This was no ordinary tomb ship, but a Cairn-class vessel, a massive war machine that had laid waste to entire fleets. Moloch and his Terminators fought their way into its depths, cutting through Necron warriors and automated defenses, pushing toward the control vault where the Necron overlord believed to be Mactlan Kutlak directed the battle. The confrontation between Moloch and the Necron overlord has become the stuff of legend, though the truth of what transpired remains sealed in classified records. What is known is that Moloch fought Kutlak in single combat, that their duel tore through sections of the tomb ship, that neither warrior was willing to yield. And then, in a moment of either catastrophic damage or deliberate sacrifice, Moloch was vented into space, his body subjected to the hard vacuum and radiation of the void. He was declared killed in action, lost in the service of the Emperor, and the Orphean War continued without him. But months later, after the campaign had ground to its brutal conclusion, after the Imperium had been forced to declare the Orpheus sector lost and order exterminatus on its remaining worlds to deny them to the Necrons, Asterion Moloch reappeared. He was alive, impossibly alive, recovered by his fleet, repaired through extensive cybernetic surgery, ready to lead his chapter once more. This was the 6th or 7th time such a resurrection had occurred, the 6th or 7th time Moloch had been reported dead, only to return. Each such incident added to the speculation about the Proteus Protocol, about the possibility that Asterion Moloch was not one man, but a legacy, a role passed from warrior to warrior, with memories and personality artificially imposed to maintain continuity. Beyond the Orphean War, the Minotaurs participated in numerous other campaigns, each adding to their dark reputation. They saw action on Rin's world, helping to reclaim the Crimson Fist's homeworld from greenskin invaders. Though notably they did not attempt to loot the ruins of the Crimson Fist's fortress monastery, suggesting perhaps that they have limits to their rapacity, or perhaps that they feared the consequences of angering Rogel Dawn's successors. They prosecuted the harrowing of the Night Reapers, a 3-year campaign to destroy a renegade chapter that had been corrupted by chaos and Xenos technology. Working alongside the Red Templars, and, eventually, the Grey Knights, the Minotaurs hunted the Night Reapers across a dozen star systems, driving them before Imperial forces until they could be brought to battle and destroyed. The campaign culminated in the Perun Cross incident, a void battle that saw the Night Reapers' flagship destroyed, with tremendous loss of life on all sides, including substantial Minotaurs casualties and the complete loss of a Grey Knight strike force. But it was the Euxine incident during the suppression of the Macarian heresy that truly cemented the Minotaurs' reputation as Brotherhood killers. When 2 Space Marine chapters, the Doom Warriors and the Inceptors, became locked in conflict over a matter of honor, the High Lords dispatched the Minotaurs to end their dispute. The bronze-clad executioners attacked both chapters simultaneously, caring nothing for the causes or rights of either side, viewing the conflict simply as a disruption to Imperial unity that had to be eliminated. The Doom Warriors, seeing the writing on the wall after the initial assault, fled the system in a barely organized retreat, preserving what they could of their chapter's strength. The Inceptors, and either more proud or more foolish, stood their ground and fought. They were destroyed almost to a man, fewer than 100 warriors surviving from a chapter that had once numbered nearly 1,000. The Minotaurs stripped them of their relics, seized their flagship, a Great Crusade-era assault transport that had served the Inceptors since their founding, and left them broken and humiliated. This action created enmity between the Minotaurs and the entire Ultramarines lineage. The Inceptors were a second founding chapter, direct successors of the Ultramarines, and their near destruction was seen as an insult to the entire Brotherhood of Guilliman's sons. The Ultramarines forbade the Minotaurs from entering Ultramar, their 500 worlds domain, and many Ultramarine successors swore oaths of vengeance, as promising that if the opportunity arose, they would repay the Minotaurs for their arrogance and brutality. Yet despite this hatred, despite the threats and the oaths, no chapter has moved against the Minotaurs, The reason remains the same as always. To attack them would be to attack the High Lords themselves, to declare oneself in rebellion against the ultimate authority in the Imperium. And so the bronze-clad executioners continue their work, feared and hated, but ultimately untouchable, protected by the patronage of powers that no Space Marine chapter can hope to challenge. In the era of the Indomitus Crusade, following the return of Primarch Rabut Guilliman and the beginning of the Imperium's greatest military expansion in thousands of years, the Minotaurs have continued to serve their masters. They participated in the recapture of the Bosphori system from Chaos forces, deploying alongside Primaris reinforcements to retake Void installations from the Thousand Suns. They fought in the Nachmund Rift War, that great struggle to control the narrow passage between the Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus in the wake of the Great Rift's opening. And they were involved in the Hexarchy incident on Terra itself, brought to the throne world by corrupt High Lords attempting to stage a coup against Guilliman's reforms. When the coup collapsed and the corrupt lords were executed, the Minotaurs withdrew, their loyalty transferring seamlessly to the new masters of the Administratum, proving once again that they serve not individuals, but the office itself, the institution of power, rather than those who currently wield it. But through all these campaigns, across centuries of warfare, the Minotaurs have maintained their reputation as the Imperium's executioners, the Brotherhood killers, the Emperor's bronze beasts who never tire and never stop. They have destroyed chapters, crushed rebellions, hunted renegades, and prosecuted wars with a ruthlessness that makes them unique even among the Space Marines. They are feared, hated, and utterly essential to the High Lord's control over the Adeptus Astartes. Gene seed and the question of lineage. At the heart of every mystery surrounding the Minotaurs lies perhaps the greatest mystery of all. Where does their gene seed truly come from? This question touches on issues of identity, loyalty, and the very nature of what it means to be a Space Marine. And the efforts that have gone into concealing the answer suggest that the truth is something that could shake the foundations of how the Imperium understands its greatest warriors. The official records, such as they are, mark the Minotaurs as products of the 21st founding, created during that great experiment in gene seed manipulation that would come to be known as the Cursed Founding. The fragmentary documents that survive from this period describe their gene seed as chimeric, a word that carries implications both profound and disturbing. Chimeric gene seed means genetic material that has been mixed, combined from multiple sources, potentially including gene lines that should never have been blended. But what sources were combined? The records do not say, or rather, they cannot be accessed because they have been sealed under edicts that bear the authority of the High Lords themselves. Even the Inquisition, which theoretically has the authority to investigate any matter of potential heresy, finds itself turned away when it attempts to examine the Minotaur's gene seed tithes. The seals are absolute, the classifications unbreakable, suggesting that whatever truth they hide is considered too dangerous to be known. The circumstantial evidence, however, points toward conclusions that many would consider heretical if spoken aloud. The Minotaur's specialization in siege warfare and attrition tactics mirrors perfectly the combat doctrines of the Iron Warriors Legion, one of the 9 traitor legions that turned to chaos during the Horus Heresy. Their paranoid, brooding nature, their obsessive attention to security and protocol, their willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve their objectives. All of these traits echo the character of Perturabo's sons. The cultural markers support this theory. The ancient Greek aesthetic that permeates Minotaur's symbolism and nomenclature, the hoplite-inspired tactics, the emphasis on discipline and hierarchical authority, all of these reflect themes that were central to the Iron Warriors before their fall. Even the Minotaur's treatment of their dreadnoughts, viewing them with cold indifference rather than reverence, mirrors how the Iron Warriors regarded their own entombed warriors, seeing them as weapons rather than honored ancients. Edwin Brown, one of the developers who helped create the modern incarnation of the Minotaurs for Forge World's Imperial Armor books, has publicly stated that in his conception, the chapter is descended from Iron Warriors' gene seed. According to his theory, a garrison of iron warriors isolated during the Horus heresy, who missed the betrayal entirely and continued to serve the Imperium in ignorance, were eventually integrated into the loyalist forces during the Great Scouring. Rather than executing them as traitors, the High Lords chose to hide their origins, using them as a secret force that could be deployed without the political complications that knowledge of their true lineage would create. If this theory is correct, and there is substantial evidence to support it beyond just the thematic parallels, well, then it would explain almost everything about the Minotaurs that seems contradictory or impossible. It would explain why their records are sealed so tightly, why their gene seed tithes cannot be examined, why they operate outside normal command structures. The High Lords would have every reason to hide the existence of a loyalist chapter descended from traitors, both to protect the chapter from those who would want them destroyed and to maintain them as a secret weapon that could be deployed without the complications that full disclosure would create. It would explain their exceptional equipment and resources. If the Minotaurs are the High Lord's private army, maintained in secret for purposes that cannot be publicly acknowledged, then of course they would be given access to the finest weapons and armor the Imperium can produce. But the costs of maintaining them would be worth it to have a force that answers only to the highest authority, that can be trusted to execute any order, regardless of how distasteful other Space Marines might find it. It would explain their rapid recruitment and replacement of casualties. If they recruit from Terra itself, drawing from the billions of candidates on humanity's throne world, then they would have access to a recruitment pool that no other chapter can match. The rapid indoctrination and training that observers have noted could be a necessity born of this constant influx of new recruits, a way to turn them into functional warriors as quickly as possible to maintain chapter strength. Most importantly, it would explain their willingness, even their eagerness, to fight other Space Marines. If the Minotaurs are descended from traitors, and if they carry in their gene seed the legacy of those who betrayed the Emperor during the heresy, then they would have no bonds of brotherhood with the rest of the Adeptus Astartes. They would stand apart, eternally grateful for the reprieve they had been granted, forever indebted to the High Lords who had chosen to hide their shame rather than expose it. They would serve without question, knowing that their very existence depends on continued obedience, that any failure might result in their terrible secret being revealed and their destruction being ordered. Yet this theory, compelling as it may be, is not the only possibility. Some have suggested the Minotaurs might be descended from other traitor legions. The old Minotaurs of the Cursed Founding, with their berserker fury and disregard for strategy, fit the profile of World Eater's successors, though this would not explain the current chapter's tactical sophistication. Others point to similarities with the Death Guard, another traitor legion that specialized in attrition warfare and siege tactics, though the Minotaurs show none of the Death Guard's obsession with endurance and disease. Still others suggest that the chimeric nature of their gene seed might mean a blend of loyalist and traitor gene lines, an attempt by the Adeptus Mechanicus to balance the strengths and weaknesses of different Primarchs' genetic legacy. Perhaps Iron Warrior's gene seed was mixed with Ultramarine stock to provide tactical flexibility, or with Imperial Fist's gene seed to enhance their siege warfare capabilities. Such experimentation would explain the Cursed Founding connection and the mutations that supposedly plagued other chapters from that era, though the Minotaurs themselves show no obvious signs of genetic instability. The truth is that without access to the sealed records, without the ability to examine their gene seed directly, any theory about the Minotaurs' origins remains speculation. But the very existence of these seals, the extraordinary efforts that have gone into hiding their lineage, speaks to a secret of profound importance. The Imperium does not seal records simply to be mysterious. It seals them to protect truths that could shake the foundations of faith and order, to hide knowledge that could undermine the very structures that hold civilization together. If the Minotaurs are indeed descended from traitor gene seed, if the High Lords have been maintaining a chapter of hidden heretics for thousands of years, then it represents a cynicism that goes to the heart of what the Imperium has become. It proves that even the sins of the Horus heresy can be forgiven if the sinners are useful enough. That the Imperium's rulers care more about control and power than about the moral principles they claim to uphold. It suggests that the entire narrative of loyalist versus traitor, the foundational myth of the Imperium in its current form, is more complicated and more compromised than the faithful are allowed to know. And perhaps that is why the truth must remain hidden. Perhaps the revelation that the High Lords maintain traitor-descended space marines as their personal executioners would do more damage than the Minotaurs' service provides in benefit. And perhaps the scandal would weaken the Imperium at a time when it can afford no weakness, would create divisions when unity is desperately needed. Or perhaps the truth is something else entirely, something even more disturbing than traitor gene seed. Perhaps the Minotaurs are an experiment in creating space marines without the complications of loyalty and brotherhood. Warriors whose genetic heritage has been deliberately obscured to make them more malleable, more controllable. Perhaps they are what the Emperor always intended space marines to be. Tools rather than sons, weapons rather than brothers, servants rather than heroes. Whatever the truth, it remains locked behind seals that will likely never be broken, hidden by authorities who have proven their willingness to do whatever is necessary to maintain their power. And the Minotaurs themselves offer no answers, maintaining their cold silence on questions of heritage and history, focused entirely on the present and the next target marked for execution by their masters on Terra. Legacy of the Labyrinth. In the end, what are we to make of the Minotaurs? What does their existence tell us about the Imperium they serve and the darkness that lies at the heart of humanity's greatest civilization? They are, in many ways, the perfect symbol of everything the Imperium has become in its 10,000 years of slow decline. Brutal, efficient, stripped of all sentiment and mercy, loyal only to power, existing only to serve purposes they may not even fully understand. They are the monster in the labyrinth, trapped within structures of authority and secrecy that define their existence, as consuming those sent to face them in an endless cycle of violence. They are the price the Imperium pays for maintaining control over its most powerful warriors, the cost of ensuring that Space Marines remain servants rather than masters. They are proof that even in a galaxy drowning in war and darkness, some choices are so terrible that they can only be made in secret, hidden behind layers of classification and lies. For the other Space Marine chapters, the Minotaurs represent an ever-present threat, a reminder that their autonomy exists only at the sufferance of terror, that their brotherhood extends only as far as their obedience. Every chapter knows that if they step too far from the path, if they question too loudly or resist too strongly, the bronze-clad executioners might come for them. This knowledge shapes behavior. It constrains choices, ensures a level of compliance that no amount of direct oversight could achieve. For the High Lords, the Minotaurs are an essential tool, perhaps the most essential tool they possess, for maintaining control over the Adeptus Astartes. In a galaxy where Space Marines could theoretically rebel and carve out their own kingdoms, where the distributed power of 1,000 autonomous chapters could threaten the central authority of Terra, the Minotaurs provide a counterweight, a force that can be deployed to crush any chapter that grows too independent or too ambitious. They are the ultimate sanction, the final argument that settles all disputes about who truly rules the Imperium. But for those who look beyond the immediate utility, who consider the broader implications of what the Minotaurs represent, they are something more disturbing. They are evidence of the Imperium's moral bankruptcy, proof that its rulers will employ any method, ally with any force, maintain any lie, if doing so serves their interests. If the theories about their traitor gene seed are true, if the High Lords have been maintaining hidden heretics for thousands of years, then it reveals a cynicism that goes to the very core of what the Imperium claims to be. The Imperium presents itself as the defender of humanity, the bulwark against chaos and Xenos threats, the last best hope for human civilization in a hostile galaxy. It demands absolute loyalty, absolute obedience, absolute faith. It burns heretics and exterminates worlds in the name of purity and order. Yet it maintains the Minotaurs, warriors who may be descended from the very traitors it claims to abhor. It is equipped with the finest weapons and armor, granted autonomy that no other chapter enjoys, deployed to destroy those who show the slightest hint of independent thought. This contradiction is not a flaw in the Imperium's logic, but rather the purest expression of its operating principles. The Imperium does not care about moral consistency or principled behavior. It cares about survival, about maintaining power, about ensuring that the structures of control remain intact regardless of the cost. If employing traitor-descended space marines helps achieve these goals, then traitor-descended space marines will be employed, and anyone who questions this decision will themselves become a target for destruction. The Minotaurs, in this light, are not an aberration, but rather the truest representation of what the Imperium has become. They are the Imperium stripped of all its heroic pretensions, all its claims to nobility and righteousness, reduced to its most basic elements: power, obedience, and the willingness to do absolutely anything to preserve the existing order. They are what happens when an empire decides that survival matters more than principle, when control becomes more important than justice, when the only value that matters is continued existence, regardless of what must be sacrificed to achieve it. And yet, for all this darkness, for all the horror of what they represent, one cannot deny their effectiveness. The Minotaurs work. They achieve their objectives. They destroy the enemies marked for them by the High Lords. They maintain the Imperium's control over the Adeptus Astartes, ensuring that the most powerful warriors humanity has ever created remain servants rather than masters. In a galaxy where the alternative to the Imperium is not freedom or justice, but annihilation at the hands of chaos or Xenos threats, perhaps that effectiveness is all that matters. Perhaps in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, there is no room for moral qualms about the tools employed in humanity's survival. Perhaps the Minotaurs, brutal and ruthless as they are, represent a necessary evil, a price that must be paid to maintain the fragile structures that keep civilization from collapsing entirely. Perhaps their existence is the Imperium's greatest shame and its greatest strength, the secret that cannot be revealed but that ensures humanity endures for another day, another year, another millennium. Or perhaps they are simply what we deserve, the monsters we have created to police ourselves, the executioners we have empowered to ensure our obedience to powers that care nothing for us beyond our utility. Perhaps the Minotaurs are the Imperium's truest face, and everything else, all the talk of honor and brotherhood and service to the Emperor, is merely the lie we tell ourselves to make their existence bearable. The truth, as always, remains hidden in the labyrinth, guarded by seals we cannot break and authorities we cannot challenge. And the bronze-clad warriors continue their work, hunting those marked for execution, crushing resistance beneath overwhelming force, demonstrating again and again that in the Imperium of man, even the Emperor's chosen warriors are not beyond the reach of those who rule in his name. If you found this exploration of the Minotaurs enlightening, if you've appreciated this journey into one of the darkest corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, I encourage you to like and subscribe to see more deep dives into the lore of the 41st millennium. The galaxy is vast, filled with countless stories of heroism and horror, triumph and tragedy, and together we can explore them all, one tale at a time. Thank you for listening, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and those who enforce its rules are often more terrifying than any enemy humanity might face.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.